I'm Shelley, and in this tutorial we're going to create an editable template for an audio waveform so that we can quickly swap out the music and logo later on without breaking the whole composition. This is for people who are fairly new to After Effects, and this would be an ideal second day in After Effects for a student. We should end up with something like this. This After Effects file has been made with the following layers down here. As opposed to sourcing directly from an MP3 file, it's using a pre-composed group to source for the file, which means we can easily go into it and change the audio track later on with anything we want, and immediately it will pick that up and update the waveform and the music to update that. The same goes with our the logo in the middle. I can easily double click on this pre-composed group here, and I can change the logo to something else if I want, and it will update in here straight away with the color effects applied. And at the very top here we can change the color of the entire waveform in one go as well, so we can just spin this dial around and change the colors of the whole video however we want. So this would be an ideal template, and if you maybe carried out some extra steps, you might even be able to sell something like this as well. Or if you're a musician, you should be able to easily put in new music and keep the overall style but change the colors like every month when you release a new track or something like that. So we first of all need to download the resource pack that I provided in the description below. This includes a royalty-free sample music track, some royalty-free images as well from Unsplash, and I've even included the final video file so that you can see how I've put this together if you want as well, before having a go at your own. Once you've downloaded these files, you need to extract them from the zip file, and you need to put them in a folder somewhere on your computer and name that folder Audio Waveform. You can obviously call it whatever you want, but it'd be great if you called it Audio Waveform. And we need to save the After Effects file that we make into this folder as well next to all of these images. It's hugely important that you save your After Effects file right next to the source images in the same folder that they're in. So I've created a new project here. That was File, New Project. If you see anything open on your screen, if you see like the purple After Effects welcome screen, you can close that down as well. If I forget to mention any shortcuts or keybinds that I'm pressing, you can look up here and you should be able to see what buttons I'm pressing if I forget to mention it as well. So we're now ready to import our files. We need to first of all check that we can see the word project up here. If we can't see the word project, you might need to make sure that this area here is made a little bit bigger by moving your mouse here and stretching that out. If you still can't see the word project, go to Window and make sure project is ticked, and this will show that. Next, we need to import our bits and bobs. So I'm going to first of all bring in the royalty-free music track into the left hand side over here, and if you want you can drag everything else in as well, but I'm only really going to need the these three images here. Everything else is really just to help you guys out. Oh, sorry, those 4 images, drag those in and we can use those later on. So now we need to create a blank video to put everything in. So we're going to go to Composition, New Composition, and we're going to check that the width and height is 1920 by 1080. If you've got a good computer, feel free to do 4K, but for this tutorial, stick to 1920 by 1080. If you do anything different, the numbers I tell you later on won't make a lot of sense. The frame rate is 25, unless of course you've got a really good computer. And we now need to check the duration of this video. I'm going to set the duration to 5 minutes, which is on the slightly longer end of the average music track. This should mean that it's easy for you to change the duration of your composition to be shorter at a later date. It's easy to make a video shorter once it's finished than it is to make it longer. So we're going to do 5 minutes for duration. So we've got hours, minutes, seconds, and frames. So 0 hours, 5 minutes, 0 seconds, and 0 frames. 0, 0, 5, 00, 00, and that should be good. I'm going to do 25, that's fine. The background color really doesn't matter. I'm going to keep it as black It will always be black when you render it anyway, no matter what you choose here. Hit OK. Your screen now comes up like this. I'm going to just click down here and hit fit to make sure it fits there. I'm now going to drag my music file to the bottom down here and let go. You can see that the stock music track does not take up the full 5 minutes, but it'd be very easy later on to just trim the duration of our video down like that. So we're immediately going to pre-compose or kind of put this file here in a group so that After Effects will treat the group as the source for the waveform as opposed to linking directly to this file. To pre-compose this, you can right click and do pre-compose, and we're going to call it Put Your Music Here. And then I'm going to click on the middle option here, so that says move all attributes into the new composition, but I'm going to untick where it says adjust the duration. I want the duration of this group, this pre-composition, to be the length of the entire video, the full 5 minutes. I'm going to make sure this bit is unticked. This option here is checked. Move all attributes to new composition. Very important. Hit OK. You'll now see your music layer has sort of almost looked like it's disappeared and turned into this brown layer. But what's really happened is this. At the moment, we're on our comp 1. This is the actual composition that we just made earlier, which happened to be called comp 1. And if we double click on this layer here, I'm going to double click on the writing or on this long bar here. You'll see it opens up a new tab called Put Your Music Here. And in there you can see your music track, and you can change this at any time you like. Let's go back to the tab over here now that says comp 1. This is our main comp where everything which we'll render at the end. We now need to create a layer for our waveform effects to go on. We cannot apply it directly to this empty layer here. So if I just move my mouse up to this option, this shows you the transparency grid, and so there's nothing behind this, and the waveform will not work. The waveform effect will not work on an empty transparent layer like this. So to make a layer that's just a solid color, you can go to Layer, New, Solid. It will come up with the solid settings here. It will be the size of your composition, which is great, and we're going to leave it as dark grey, but I'm going to rename it. I'm going to call it Waveform, and I'm going to hit OK. You've now got a new layer here that's got like red on it, and this screen will go slightly grey, which means it's filled in. If I go back to my transparency grid, there's no transparency anymore. I'm now going to go to my effects and presets and immediately apply the waveform effect. It's not even called waveform though, it's called audio spectrum. There is something else called audio waveform, but audio spectrum is what I'm using, and it's a lot better. So you can double click on audio spectrum, or if you're quite slow at double clicking like my students, you can just drag it onto your red layer down here, and it will apply the audio spectrum effect. Please make sure you only have one audio spectrum setting up here. If you've dragged it on twice, it will indeed put another one on, and it will completely ruin your entire day. So if you see something that says audio spectrum 2, click on the word there and hit delete. You should only have one. So if I drag my time slider, these little dots, they're not moving, and they really should be. So let's check if there is even any audio coming into it. I'm going to click on the Put Your Music Here layer, and I'm going to double tap the letter L on the keyboard. That's L for levels, or L for llama. So double tap L, and you'll see it shows you the real waveform of this file, and you can see when it starts and when it ends. While I'm here, I'm going to tell After Effects how much of the video I want it to actually render. I know that in this instance the track ends here, and so I want the render to end there as well. If I move a mouse to this side, I can drag the work area end, this tall blue bar, and drag it all the way to where my music ends here. And since I don't want to see all of this extra timeline, I can use this top one. This top option here, this top blue dot, is like a magnifying glass and zooms into time itself. And I can say, you know what, I only want to sort of focus on the first section of this 5 minutes that I have available to me, and that will do. So you can now sort of fill out your whole timeline with this particular music track. At a later date, if you wanted to see a longer track, you would just simply drag this one out and you can see more stuff. And if you want to render more stuff, you would drag that out as well. So now let's tell our waveform layer to use the Put Your Music Here layer as its source so that these dots can move. So I'll click back on my waveform layer. and I can see the effect controls. If you ever cannot find your effect controls, go to Window and make sure that effect controls is ticked, and you'll see it as long as you're on the correct layer. So we're going to start off with the top bit, which says audio layer. Simply choose layer 2. Put your music here. Immediately, if we drag our time slider to a point where there's music, you can see that these lines are now dancing around, which is great. So I'm temporarily going to try and see a lot more bands here of sound. So if I'm going to go straight and skip some of these settings now, go straight down to frequency bands, and I'm going to increase this to about 500. You can type in 500 or drag the blue numbers there, and these lines become a lot more solid, which sort of shows you sort of what wavelength most of the music track is happening. In this music track, if I drag my time slider through it, it's only really the sort of stuff at this end of the spectrum that's doing stuff. The right hand side isn't really doing much at all, so we've got the lower frequencies down here, like your bass sounds, and the higher frequencies up here, like what bats can hear and stuff. And so we might want to change how much of the audio spectrum this is displaying. To do that, I'm going to go to where it says end frequency. And just in case there's something else going on up here, I can temporarily maybe increase the end frequency. And you can see then that all of this music track's happening way down here. So I'm going to drag the end frequency back down to about 800. So the end frequency, you can drag it down to about 800. To be honest, with most tracks, I find that 800 is a pretty good value and shows most of what's happening in the music visually without having lots of dead space. Of course, if it was like opera, you would need to show a little bit more. And if it was really true drum and bass, you could probably get away with even less than 800. Before we move on, we need to choose the shape of this line. We could just stick with a straight line, but quite a lot of YouTubers like to have their logo in the middle with all of these sort of bars going around it in a radial manner. To do that, we simply need to create what's called a mask or a shape with this layer selected. So make sure that your waveform layer is selected now, and you should see a crosshair in the middle of your screen. If you do not see the red dots around the edge or a crosshair in the middle, go to Window and make sure that, go to View and make sure that Show Layer Controls is ticked, and then you should see a crosshair in the middle. This crosshair is where you need to drag your circle. So I'm going to go up here and choose, instead of the rectangle tool, I'm going to choose the ellipse tool. The rectangle should be there by default. I'm going to move my mouse to the middle of the screen, and as accurately as possible, I could even zoom in if I want. I'm going to go to this little red crosshair in the middle, and I'm going to click and start to drag a circle. It will create a mask, and everything will look like it's disappearing until you make this bigger. So while you're clicking and holding your mouse, you then, while still clicking and holding your mouse, hold Control and Shift. So Control and Shift will enable you to create a perfect circle. I'm going to hit Command Z there. I am going to need to zoom out for this steps. So I'm going to hit Fit again and get my circle tool. So if you made a mistake with the circle, you have to undo it, or hit Delete if you see a mask down here. There can only be one mask. Try that again. Move my mouse to the middle of the screen as accurately as I can, and then hold Control. I click and drag a circle first. You must click the mouse first on its own, and then hold Control and Shift later on. If you try hold Control and Shift first, it will try and select weird layers and stuff. So click your mouse first and drag and hold, then hold Control Shift, and I'm still holding all those buttons now. And I want this circle to be about a third of the size of my canvas here, and about that size will do. So about between a third to a half of the size will be fine. When you're happy, you can let go of your mouse, then let go of Control and Shift, so it stays as a perfect circle. I can see I'm still in the create circle mode. I want to get out of that by going back to my selection tool, which looks like a paper airplane up here. So I'll just click on that, and now I can select things like normal. Your mask might be yellow or a different color to mine. It doesn't matter, as long as you've got one mask down there. If you have other masks, you need to delete them and just keep this one. Next, we need to tell our waveform layer to use this outline of this mask as a path for this waveform to follow along. So I'll go to where it says path and it says none. I'll choose mask 1, and now the waveform has wrapped around there. But if you drag your time slider around left and right, you'll see that it looks like it's getting cropped off at the top and the sides into like a square shape. And so we need to fix this technical problem straight away. To fix this problem, where you've got the wave bars getting cropped, you go down into where it says mask 1. If you cannot see that, make sure the drop down by waveform is facing down, the drop down by masks is facing down, and the drop down by mask 1 is facing down, or whatever mask number you have. Find mask expansion and increase mask expansion to 700 to fix the issue. You see, as you increase the mask expansion, more of your bars will be visible, all the way up to 700. I'm just going to type it in. So once you've set this up, you've now done all the boring technical things to make this work. Now you could literally finish this tutorial and not watch anymore and just simply go through all of these numbers and have a play around and change any of them, and you won't be able to really break it. You can just see what creative things you can do with the colors and what side things are being displayed on, and what kind of shapes you've got and things like that. However, if you carry on watching this tutorial, I'll show you how to create this effect that we had earlier on at the beginning. So first, I want to change the number of bars or bands of this pink sort of waveform here back down to 100. So on the left hand side, I'm going to go to frequency bands and change this to 100. Now that I've done that, they're far too skinny and I need to increase the thickness of them. So I'm going to go and change where it says thickness and change it to 10. Now they have a blurry edge on the outside of them. If I just pan around here, you can see the edges of them are a bit blurry. I don't like that. It looks a bit early 2000s. So I'll go to where it says softness and drag that down to the left to 0. Now these have solid edges on the outside. These bars aren't moving around too much, but I'm going to go to maximum height and just adjust it to 500 for maximum height. So you can just see a little bit more action in there. So I'm now done with this layer, and I now want to have a new layer with a slightly different effect on it. I need to rename this layer first though, just so I know what it is. It's going to get really confusing later on. So I'm going to right click on my layer and hit rename, or you can hit the enter key on the keyboard and I'm going to type in a word afterwards. So I'm going to call this main bands. So these are going to be my main or the most bold or visible bands in this video. So they will be these guys here, the most obvious ones. To duplicate your layer, you just hit Control D or Command D on a Mac, and you've now got another layer. Just to demonstrate this, if I move my my circle around, it does indeed change shape. I won't be doing that. I want this one to be this sort of inside electricity line that we've got going in here. So to do that, I'm going to make sure I'm the correct layer. I'm going to rename this first of all to, I could just call it electricity line or just continuous line. And then to change it into a continuous line, you go down here to the display options, and I'm going to choose analog lines. You'll see then a squiggly line will go through your circle, but I only want it to be squiggly at the underside, not on the top. So where it says side options, choose side A. Side A is the inside, side B is the outside. Now I want these lines to be a bit sort of closer towards the center, so they're not even touching the other bands. To do that, I need to scale this layer down. The safest way of doing that is actually to go into your transform controls down here with the drop down arrows and drag your scale numbers down. If you just go straight to these red dots, you might accidentally warp the image. You can not do that by just holding shift, but it's sometimes safer just to come down here and edit the scale. You're looking for something like this so that the outside frequency bands do not touch this continuous line. There's always a gap in between. I'm now going to decrease the thickness of this line. So I'm going to go to thickness and bring it back to 3 and see how that looks. That's better. Now, I did forget to do the colors earlier, and it's actually quite important. So I'm going to go to my main bands layer and just look at the colors. I'm going to first of all go to where it says hue interpolation, which is where you can drag the style left or right, and it starts to introduce like neighboring colors in the color wheel to your design. If you spin it around too much, obviously you get the full rainbow, but I'm just going to drag it to 90 degrees to the left. So I'm going to type in, you could type in -90 here, and you get a slightly different color at the top to the bottom. I am going to leave mine with pink and purple, and later on it's actually easy to change these colors all in one go, like we had earlier on. So it doesn't even matter what color it is as long as you have the hue interpolation set to -90 for this effect. And I need to remember to do that now for my continuous line on the inside where it says hue interpolation. I'm just going to type in -90, the exact same number, and now the inside line, the colors also sort of match. I can see here as well that my bars have sort of like a different color around the edge of them. I need to change that. I'm going to go back to my main bands, and that's to do here with the outside color. I'm going to get that. I might get the inside color and just pick on the outside color to sample that. Or you could do it the other way around. Either way, try and get these two colors exactly the same by sampling one or the other, like that. And you might need to do the same on the continuous line as well. Just make them choose the same color. And that is it now. From here on in, we can duplicate this and not worry too much. The next most obvious waveform element in my previous video was the one around the logo in the middle. We're going to do that right now as well. For that one, we're going to duplicate our main bands. So I'm going to hit Control D. Before I hit Control D, sorry, I'm going to just collapse all the details for these layers down. It was getting quite busy, so I'll just hit the drop down arrow here to collapse those. I'm now going to duplicate my main bands. I'm going to right click, rename them to logo bands, and I will then scale these down. You could hit S for scale on the keyboard with this layer clicked on, which will just show you the scale attribute, or you can hit the drop down arrow and go to scale and drag the scale down about there. So if I zoom out so we can see the full area, that should be a good amount. I'm now going to change the bands so the thickness is 5 on these ones. I want it to only do side B, which is the outside, but I want lots of bands. I in fact want to go to frequency bands and increase them to about here. You could have a solid edge like this, that will look quite nice. If you increase these to about 1,000, you won't even see any bands at all. It just looks like one sort of solid blobby shape. I'm just going to go a little bit to the left so I can see some kind of line going on like that. And maybe not, I'll just do a blobby shape just so we can experiment. And then those are the 3 layers that we'll use. All the rest of the layers now are going to be sort of the special effects like these glows and repeating lines coming out. Well, before I do that, sorry, I do need to rotate my inside layer around. As you can see here, there's a few points in the music where it gets quite loud and it sort of overlaps, and the two loudest, or the loudest part of the track sort of overlap here. So to stop that from happening, you can go to your continuous line layer and actually rotate the layer so that the loud parts aren't in the same area. So I go back to my selection tool, go to my logo bands, and in the transform area here, if you can't see that, hit the drop down arrow for transform, or simply hit R on the keyboard to isolate that one. I'm going to drag the rotation value here until I'm happy. So I'm going to drag the rotation value to about there. And I might even go to the scale again. I'm going to hit S for scale and drag that down a little bit more just so that the bands don't really touch. It doesn't matter if they do, but I'm just going to do that. Now for the special effects, let's go to our continuous line layer and we're going to duplicate this. And we're going to call this new one blurry lines inside. You'll see why in a minute. With that layer clicked on now, I'm going to go to my effects and presets up here and I'm going to search for radial blur. That's radial blur. And I'm going to double click on CC radial blur. This adds the radial blur effect to our layer. And in there I can change the type from scratch, which is like a sideways thing, like an old record, and change it to straight zoom. And then if you increase the amount, you should start seeing something happening. I've dragged it down to the negative numbers. I want this to be on the inside. So if you drag this down a little bit to like -30 or something, you'll see something happening in the middle. If you change the quality down though, weirdly, if you change the quality down from 50 to as low as it goes, which is 10, you actually see this happen. It just shows you more lines, which is quite nice. I'm actually now going to decrease the amount to about -70 for this effect. And that kind of just looks like it's duplicated the line lots and lots of times, which looks quite cool. And now we're going to go to the outside as well. So if I duplicate my continuous line again with Command D, right click, rename, I'm going to call it blurry lines outside, and get my radial blur, drag it onto there, or double click on the outside one, and same thing, straight zoom. This time drag the amount so it's happening on the outside, so this will be a positive number this time. Drag the quality down to 10 so you can see what's going on, and you can increase the amount to whatever you want. I'm just going to, obviously if you do it too far you won't see anything, but I think this amount, 75, is a good amount for that one. If you want it to be more obvious or clearer, the simplest way of doing it is simply to duplicate your layer so it stacks. So with my blurry outside lines, I'm going to do Control D, and when you do that, you see them get sort of clearer like this. They're so clear, in fact, I'm going to change the value of both of these layers to 100, and that's good. And the last, but probably the best effect is we're going to go to our big main bands layer. We're going to duplicate that with Control D, and this time we're going to put radial blur on as well, but we're going to use the fading zoom effect, and I'm going to increase the amount, which creates this. So I might just change this amount to about 100. Yeah, well, that's quite nice, and that sort of just helps these bands as well. It just looks quite awesome. I'm going to rename this main bands 2 layer before I forget what it is. I'm going to right click and hit rename and call it main bands fading zoom. So for this final sort of bit, to get this really quite a big glow in the background that goes with the music, I'm duplicating my main bands layer again. This is the original main bands layer. I'm going to do Control D. For them to have such a massive effect on this scene, we need to increase the maximum height all the way up so that they start going off the screen almost, like that. Next, we're going to add what's called a directional blur. So we're going to go up to the effects and presets and type in direction, and it will show you the directional blur. You can double click on that, and when you start to increase the blur length on your directional blur, you'll see it looks quite interesting. And so I'm going to drag that up about there. I want it to be at 90 degrees. You can drag this dial to make them go at any angle you want. I'm going to keep them at straight 90. And I'm going to increase the blur length quite a lot, like this. You can do what you want, but the more you blur it, the more faded it gets, which is good because I don't want this to be the focal point of the whole thing. And you could just have an effect like that. And if you want this to look even brighter, if you just increase the maximum height, it does have more of an effect like that. If you did too much, the whole scene does get a little bit sort of flashy, and so I'm now going to decrease the opacity of this layer down. So I'm also going to rename it while I'm here. I'm going to hit enter on the keyboard and call this main bands directional blur, and I'm going to go and hit the drop down arrow and go to transform and find opacity. You could also hit T on the keyboard to show opacity. I'm going to drag that down to about 50%, so it's not too intense, it's not the focal point of the whole thing. Next, if you want to do a background that isn't black, I'm going to collapse all my layers down here so I can see everything. I'm going to simply just get a rectangle tool from the top. I'm going to make sure that no layers are selected for this. I need to make sure that no layers are selected at all. I'll drag a big rectangle over everything. I'll make it a dark color. I'm just going to put it underneath everything for now. I'm just going to rename it to background, or BG. And at the top, you've got the fill color here that you can change. Mine happens to be matching mine, but if I were you, get your fill color and use the pipette tool to sample an existing color in your scene. Which this looks quite nice as well, actually, quite a bright background. I'm just going to choose, let's say, this pink color here. And then I'm going to choose a much darker tone of that color by just dragging that color slider right the way down. So the outside is still, it's not black anymore, and it's not pure pink, but it just picks up those tones and it all works, and it's all matching colors, and it looks quite nice. I'm going to hit OK on that. If you want the edges to be a lot darker and maybe even go black, you can add a vignette. To add a vignette with your background layer selected, you can go up here and type in VIG, very weird spelling, and find CC vignette. You can double click on that, and that will increase the darkness of the corners there, and you can increase or decrease the amount depending on what you're going for and what your style is. We're now ready to put the logo in the middle. To do that, we need to, I'm going to zoom in a little bit for this. I'm going to deselect my layer. You need to make sure all your layers are deselected. I am going to drag a new circle in. I'm going to go to my ellipse tool, and I want to find the middle of this here. So I'm going to guess roughly where the middle of this circle is. I'm going to start clicking with my mouse. After I've begun to click with my mouse, I'm going to hold Control and Shift and try and match this circle so it's just ever so slightly bigger than the waveform around it. And I'm going to go to the word fill, the blue word fill, not the box, but the blue word fill. Click on that and change it to no fill and hit OK. I'm now going to get my move tool, and I should be able to move this shape around. I'm going to zoom in closely, make sure my cursor clicks on the white line of this. If you can't see a white line, make sure you've got your stroke. My stroke here is set to about 3 pixels, and it's set to a white stroke. If you didn't have a stroke at all, you should be able to click on the word stroke and choose a solid color like white, and then try and match this up as best as you can, because this is going to help our audience know where the logos are going to be. So I'm just going to pop that here like so. You can use the keyboard arrows to help you as well, to make sure this is quite accurate. I'm going to leave it like that, so it's just slightly bigger than that. Then I'm going to group this into a new layer. So I could rename this as well. I'm going to call this Crop Guide, so that our audience knows where things will be cropping. And I'm going to right click and hit Pre-Compose. Make sure I hit the middle option here, move all attributes into the new composition. And I'm going to call this group Put Your Logo Here and hit OK. It will then turn brown and it'll say Put Your Logo Here. We now need to go inside this group. The moment we do this, we'll bring a new tab in up here. So I'm going to double click on this. It brings us inside that group where there's nothing. This black background isn't even real. It's not there. If you click on this icon, I'm going to bring it back so I can see stuff. I'm now going to import a temporary logo into here to test this. So I'm going to go to where it says Project, and I'm going to go to let's get a picture in first. So you could get like a musician, a picture in here. And obviously if you put the musician JPEG underneath the crop circle, you can scale this down and you get a bit of a guide then as to what will be inside the circle in the middle, like this. And that's a pretty good crop. Now to come back to see everything else that you've been doing so far, go back to where it says Comp 1 and click on Comp 1 and you'll see this. It hasn't cropped it yet, it's still going around the outside. So to crop this, click on your layer here that says Put Your Logo Here and get your circle again. This time you should see the center point here. You can move your mouse over that center point, start dragging the mouse without holding anything on the keyboard, and you'll see it's immediately starting to crop. Now hold Control and then Shift and drag this circle out so it kind of is ever so slightly smaller than the waveform lines, or kind of like that. And then you can let go of your mouse first, then let go of Control and Shift. You can then use the keyboard arrows if you want to just nudge this ever so slightly around. So you've now got that in the middle. You can easily change the logo here by going inside there and putting a new layer on top. So I could say I want to bring in this logo. I'll drag it on top of the musician. I could turn the musician off and I can scale this logo down to fit the circle. And you can see it sort of fits in there as well, which is quite nice. That's also quite bright. So if I do that, and if you think it's a little bit too bright, we can add a hue and saturation effect to this. So I can type in HUE for hue and saturation. I can double click on hue and saturation and just say that I maybe want the lightness of this layer just to be a little bit less, like that. And it will go grey. You can also hit colorize and do all sorts of fun things with it. But we're going to use a special layer now that will change the color of everything we want on the fly. To do that, we can go up to Layer, New, and we're going to use a adjustment layer like this. This layer is completely transparent, but what you can do, you could apply something like hue and saturation to it, so it has an effect on everything underneath it. It's like putting colored gel paper over a light to change the color of the light. So I'm going to get my hue and saturation and double click on that with the adjustment layer on, and I'm going to hit the box for colorize. This will colorize your whole scene so it all kind of matches one color. You might not want to do this. You might actually like having different colors like the purples and the pinks. But if you do this, this gets grayed out, but you can then increase the saturation down here to something like 50-ish, and then you can change the hue to whatever you think works. Or if you untick colorize, you can still drag the hue around to change the colors of stuff. If you want to give the logo some color, you have to go back to your logo layer and hit colorize on that as well, and decrease the lightness slightly, increase the saturation, and then drag the colorize hue degrees number here until it kind of has a color that matches something in your scene, like this pink. And then you can go back to your adjustment layer at the top and play around with this, and everything will kind of go with it now, which is really good. You've now completed this tutorial. The finishing touches might be to rename any remaining layers like this. I'll call this one Adjust Color, and that's pretty much it. You're now ready to render this off or to save this After Effects file and use it for your music in the future.